Hey everybody. Uh, long time no see. It's been quite a while since I've made one of these. Um, I decided to give Summoners on another shot. So for those of you who may have checked out my channel, like I don't know, however long, more than a year at this point, I tried making like Summoners on work in Path of Diablo some time ago, and it wasn't particularly successful. So, but I decided to give it another shot this season, and essentially the main reason for that was basically Patch 19's Insight. Now, that was more than a patch ago, but the changes from that patch are obviously still present in this patch, and I just didn't have time to play last patch like I did this patch. So I decided to give it another shot and see if I get Summoners on to work out much better than before. For those of you who don't know, patch 19's Insight essentially had two major changes to the Amazon. Um, well, at least to the Summoner Amazon, right? The first is that Infinity now works on spears as opposed to just pole arms. And this is kind of a big deal because this allows you to essentially put your conviction aura on top of your spear, and that frees up the mercenary weapon aura for whatever mercenary you decide to use. Now, I've given two different mercenary styles a shot here. Well, um, two different mercenary weapons, and I'll cover that a little bit more. So that's the first change. It's really like being able to move conviction onto a spear or a pike, manage to free up another aura for your mercenary that you can then add to your Valkyries. In addition to that, Zinsight also increased the fend percent damage, which I'm honestly going to discuss a little bit later, as I don't think it's particularly relevant to the success of the build. But essentially, what it did is that the percent bonus from Fend to Valkyrie increased from 2% damage per level to 18% damage per level. That is a huge difference, but the reality is that it really doesn't make the Valkyries work much better. Um, I'll just cover that now, actually. The primary reason is because the only form of AoE that the Valkyries really get is from their lightning damage. And so, unfortunately, there really isn't much benefit, especially when it comes to clearing maps, of increasing the physical damage. This does help with bosses, but once again, when we get to bosses, we're going to see that we run into another issue with the Valkyries that make them essentially non viable for that situation. All right, so getting into the build. First, you're going to need a token of absolution. That's because this build is really bad, and you're going to need a token of absolution to change your build into something that's less bad. After that, you're obviously going to want infinity for your matriarchal pike. And another change I decided to do compared to my previous attempt with the summoners on was I decided to really double down on passive and magic skills. So previously, I think I was using like a Griffin's Eye diadem or maybe even a Shaco. This time, I decided to just go straight for a +3 passive magic skills Amazon circlet. Basically, just really trying to pump those Valkyries, trying to make them as useful as possible. For my amulet, it's +3 passive magic skills. Once again, this is probably the second best type of amulet you can get. What you really want, best in slot, would be +3 passive magic skills, plus minion damage, and you'd want to get a +1 skill corruption, which I could not find one of those at all. The next thing is Peace Archon Plate. Obviously, doubling the amount of Valkyries literally doubles your damage, so it's a no-brainer. For Gauntlets, +3 passive magic skills, 20% increased attack speed is probably the best secondary mod you can get on here. That's just because if you do decide to go in and stab things with your little spear, you're going to want that extra attack speed. I do realize this is a pike. Guys have no idea how much trouble I had trying to find a +3 jab pike. There's like nobody trading this season. For boots, I did Sandstorm Trek. Ideally, these would be corrupted for resistances, but they were like the only pair I had, so I didn't want to like just risk a brick. For belt, previously I had T Gods. Several users and commenters basically like corrected me by pointing out that T Gods, the plus skills from T Gods, will not boost your Valkyrie damage. So in this case, Arachnid Mesh becomes the best choice. And then finally for rings, I'm doing double Bull Kaphos. Ideally, you'd want these corrupted for light absorb. Now, I know that Wisp Projector is pretty tempting here, but what I find works better is to not bother. The reason is because summons die quite a lot. You're going to be resummoning your Valkyries, stuff like that. And while Wisp Projector may give you enough damage, your Valks kind of do enough damage. You really just don't want them to die very often. So I find that just having another +1 to all skills is, in my opinion, more meaningful for your Valkyries than it is to just grab a bit more physical damage from Wisp Projector. The 10% buff to all damage from the Lifted Spirit Aura is nice, but I really don't think it's like that important, to be honest, relative to just increasing your Valkyrie life, which, I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, like, some other problems with the Valkyries, including their life, when I'm talking about like the pros and cons of this build. On the W, so a little bit different from last time. So Spirit is obviously probably the best in slot, and that's just because +2 skills, and then we're gonna have Heart of the Oak on the other slots instead of previously I'd Call to Arms. So the main reason for this is because you really don't want to be in a situation where you have to recast all your shouts. Unfortunately, your Valks are pretty tanky, and in most maps, they're actually going to be pretty hard to kill. But whenever you get a map that's something like bleed per second, open wounds, or anything that does a ridiculous amount of poison damage, such as Lilith, you're going to have to be resummoning your Valkyries a lot. And in that situation, you'd rather have +3 to all skills rather than have +1 to all skills, and then you have to do shouts to rebuff your Valks. I do realize that probably you get slightly tankier Valks, but just, the negative of having to do resummons is too much of a negative for this build. Charms are pretty simple. Obviously, we want plus passive magic skills, lifers. These are very cheap as before, although I will say they were much harder to acquire this season. Hellfire Torch, obviously, Annihilus, blah, 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 blah. And then finally, your small charms. So this is very important. You want to try and snag as many all resists, more so than you want, like, life. And the reason is because, if you may have noticed from this equipment, there's basically no resistances. So in a perfect world, you'd fill up your bottom slot with plus all res, and then this would be preferably 3 socket with nothing but plus res. You'd get Scarab Shell boots with res, and you get like light absorb on your rings or something like that. Because if you look at your resistances, I mean, yeah, these are pretty rough. Like, these are like Uber Mephisto is going to like 2-shot you, right? Now, what doesn't have bad resistances, though, of course, are your Valkyries. They actually have pretty decent resistances. So as you can see, compared to last time, I managed to get a few more skill points into Valkyries, a bit more physical synergies. As for the Mercenary, so we actually have quite a few options here. So I think Andariel's Visage Demon Head is probably the best in slot for this build. You definitely want to have your Mercenary alive as much as possible, and I think Steel Shade works only melee only. I think that's the reason why I didn't bother with Steel Shade. I gave her Chamrune, obviously, because I don't want her to be frozen, and right now she just has a 35-15 Jewel in there. I would put another one, but I really don't think that little bit extra damage and attack speed is going to make this build suddenly so much better. All right, also for the Mercenary, kind of best in slot would be a Faith Blade Bow. Now, this is actually a little bit arguable. So the main reason for this would be the Fanaticism Aura, which increases the attack speed of your Valkyries. And since we really just care about that lightning damage for the Valkyries, you really want them to have more attack speed more than anything else, because that tends to be one of the negatives of the Valkyries. Fanaticism allows them to do that. However, another option, and I'm going to play some like footage here, which I actually found to perhaps be even better, would be to instead run a Harmony Bow. And the main reason for that is that really your Valks don't need much more damage. I mean, if you actually look, they're doing like 13k lightning damage, and it does have a charge strike spread. So it's really not bad. You can probably see on screen. So this was like a 740-ish% map. And you can see that the charge lightning actually does a solid amount of damage and clears pretty decently well. So they don't really need more damage. If they could get a faster attack speed, that's better. But honestly, them moving from target to target and not having to resummon them as much for positioning, honestly, in a lot of cases just tends to be the better option. So I think it's a little bit debatable whether to prefer Faith or Harmony in this slot. Both are good, but Harmony is definitely the cheaper option, and it works pretty darn well actually. Finally, we have the armor. So here I have a duress dust shroud. The main thing here was I was trying to get open wounds to try and clear Ubers. Obviously, for maps, you would prefer shaft stop instead, four socketed up shaft stop. However, this is probably not even the best choice for Ubers. Now, this is going to sound crazy. Don't laugh. But probably the best would be a corrupted four socketed Crowcaw as the best in slot for your mercenary if you're trying to complete Ubers. Crowcaw, for those of you guys don't know, is a triculated mail. It gives open wounds, it gives attack speed, and you can socket it, four sockets, and then you could put like 440-15s in there. The problem with that is that it's so worthless of an item in every other context that you're never going to find it because no one is going to hold on to one to sell. That being said, it doesn't really matter which armor you use. Um, the reality is that your mercenary is very squishy and will probably die no matter what if you're trying to do Ubers, which is essentially where we're going to go with this build. Now, we can talk a bit about alternative options here. The obvious thing is to put open wounds onto your gloves and, free up your mercenary to have a much more durable armor. But then you have to give up +3 skills for your Valkyries. And you know what? Just play the clips of Ubers with my Valkyries. And so just play the clips. Ooh, okay, that was rough. So, all in all, let's go ahead and talk about the Valkyries themselves. So, um, I mean, the truth of the matter is that the Valkyrie is not a bad summon per se, with all these bonuses and stuff like that, but it's just not good enough, right? I mean, we're talking about at this point level 52 Valkyries, and there's a number of problems with trying to make this, especially when you compare it to other summoner builds. Now, um, the most obvious thing isn't really so much the damage. I mean, like, the Valks are doing 13k lightning damage plus another 3,000 physical damage. That's pretty solid, and there is AOE there. But the problems are, one is that you only have two Valkyries. You could consider doing something like Metal Grid to have more summons, but the reality is summon builds on their own without an alternative source of damage are never actually very fast at clearing maps. So it doesn't really like make it much better. Now, if you did something ridiculous, like you buffed the amount of Valkyries to 3, 4, maybe 5, like, okay, that's crazy. But, like, let's say you could get, like, 4 Valkyries, right? And you could put a Harmony bow on a mercenary. Suddenly, yes, probably clear is going to be, like, decent and ridiculously safe. And that would make the build okay. It'd make it playable. It'd make it kind of playable at running maps. Um, but the reality of the situation is that in order to do something like that, you would end up with situations where you just see bosons or spearsons, casually putting enough points of Valkyrie to get like 3, like, because it doesn't cost a lot for spearsons to max Valkyrie and so I don't really see a mechanic like that being a feasible way to buff this build. Not that this build needs to be buffed; it's obviously a meme build. But then the other thing is that, like, when you consider the investment, right? So let's compare it to like a Druid Grizzly. So I did an Uber's attempt with this build, and it didn't go very well. And one of the things was that despite you look at the stats of the Valkyrie, it's got 85 elemental resistances, plus 550 attack rating, plus 520% defense. Its life is only 5,000, right? And I was talking to this druid who he came in and he was like, levels lower to me, and I couldn't clear Ubers, and he cleared it with his summoner druid. And I myself have cleared Ubers with a level 76 summoner druid before, so like much lower level. Um, One of the things is like just the way difference in tankiness for the level of investment. I mean, we're talking that I put almost every single skill point into buffing Valkyries, and at the end of the day, they have 5,016 life. Now, you compare that to a Druid Grizzly, and you get something like 9.9k to 10k HP at level 38. So essentially, for 14 levels higher and every skill point dedicated to a Valkyrie, you know, no matter what kind of druid you're building, you could just build a grizzly instead, right? You don't even need to be a summoner druid. You could be any sort of druid, and your druid is as tanky or tankier than the Valkyrie. It's nuts. Um, and especially when you start running into things like Uber Mephisto, right? Those resistances are just zero, and so he basically obliterates them no matter what. So that's kind of essentially the core issues here. So one is that it's a summoner build with only two summons, and that's never going to be good no matter how good the damage is. And for summons, this is good damage, like 16k damage. Okay, I mean it's lightning damage, so it's actually 3k to 16k. So 3k to 16k damage is good. Like I don't think many of us would dispute that for summons that's pretty good damage. But the problem is that you only have two of them, and you have to invest a lot. And so you might argue, well, but they're pretty strong summons, right? So maybe this isn't a summon that's good for clearing lots of enemies. Maybe it's just good for things like Ubers, right? And I will say, when it gets to the lesser evils, like if you go to Duriel, you go to Lilith, you go to even um, Iswal, right? Yeah, actually, you just kind of like sit back, relax, and you watch your Valks clean up. It's pretty nice actually, pretty safe, and definitely like not intimidating. But then the moment you get into like any form of AOE boss, so this would be Uber Diablo, even Uber Bale, and he's like weak as hell, and Uber Mephisto, oh, especially Uber Mephisto, yeah, just goodbye. Like your Valks cannot do anything. He just runs through them. He instantly kills them. And then on top of that, with Uber Tristram, because there's so many enemies, it's hard to get your Valks focusing on the targets you want. And then to make all of that worse, you're dependent on your mercenary staying alive for deadly wounds. Even if you didn't do that, you'd have to go into melee range, and then you would just die. And even if you don't go into melee range, your resistances are so terrible that you die anyway. And so basically, um, the end of the story is that unfortunately, I really wanted this build to be good, but it is not good. In terms of mapping, there's no other way to put it. This is basically like a D tier build. I know in the past I have called this build C minus, and it's since gotten buffed. But the reality is that, I mean, I've played Hemomancer recently, and I've seen what a true S tier build looks like. In terms of mapping, this is a D tier build. Maybe we could say C minus if we want to be generous. In terms of clearing hell mode content, it's fine. Like, but um, it's not the best, and that's kind of like the least important part of the game because people can just rush you for everything. So I don't know. I would say that that's not really relevant, but fine. In terms of clearing health mode content, I'm gonna give it a B. And then finally, in terms of like boss clearing, so this would be things like Uber Tristram and Diablo clone. I'm afraid it's an F. And the reason why I have to give it an F is because it's not capable of doing it, so it is failing. So, yeah, that makes me a little sad to say. I really wanted this build to work, but I really don't think it does. I think you could play around with a ton of different options. People in the comments can give me a bunch of suggestions, but I'm so sure that there's not going to be a reasonable thing that's not going to cost like 50 HR that's going to make this build work. Yeah, I can find tri-res boots and all that, and I'm still sure that my Valks will just instantly die to Mephisto, and then I'll do no damage, and then I'll just die, and then I'll be sad. And you don't want me to be sad, so yeah. So just, I mean, I'm down to hear suggestions, but I don't think this is a viable build. Now, how would I make this better? Um, I'm not really sure. It depends. Like, what's the goal? Like, if is this to make like if you wanted to make this better for mapping, or you wanted to make it better for um, Ubers. Now, I think mapping is actually surprisingly the more reasonable thing to make the build better at. Um, but I think the thing though is that you really don't want to make it that Valkyries are just good, like crazy good, with no investment, because then it's just a very cheap spot for bosons or spearsons to put points into when they really haven't kind of like, sort of earned it, so to speak, right? Um, so what I would consider is to find other ways of synergies, like maybe like, you know, if you could have like, if you put 20 points in decoy, like if you put 20 points in decoy, you get another Valkyrie, for example, or um, stuff like that. I would try to find like where other synergies could be used to buff Valkyrie. I don't think Valkyries need more damage. I also think that the physical damage on them is kind of almost pointless. But I would instead look at like essentially that, like where can we find ways to sneak in like, a third Valkyrie or even a fourth Valkyrie. Especially because using peace is already so expensive, like because you're giving up an armor slot just for an extra Valkyrie. Your resistances are terrible. You've earned that Valkyrie using that terrible armor. So that's the big thing. I think like just having another Valkyrie or two, and then you could run like a Harmony bow mercenary would go a long way into just like really helping this map clear. Because like at that point, Harmony plus four Valks, they're gonna zoom around and they are going to clear maps. Um, Maybe not all of them, but they're gonna be able to do a lot of them, I think. Um, for Ubers, I think is a little bit more challenging. The reality is that you have to find ways to both make the build and the Valkyries tankier. One option here is, like I said before, like Decoy is a pretty terrible skill. You can make it so that perhaps there's an HP synergy between Decoy and Valkyrie. That will make the Valkyries way more tanky. You know, even something like 5%. So like by level 20, 100% life bonus would double the Valkyrie HP. And I know it sounds like nuts. People might think, whoa, 100% life bonus? That's crazy. But keep in mind that just makes it equal to the druid's bear. Like, and that's it, right? That's not even like that crazy. That's still like Mephisto will like two shot it. So I take it back. It shouldn't even be 100%. It should be like 200% or something nuts if you wanted this to be even remotely viable for Ubers. And even then, for it to be viable for Ubers, you would need to really, really like find ways to increase your resistances by a lot. And so that's means at minimum you're going to need fantastic boots. You're going to need an entire bottom row of 5% res charms, which can be very expensive if you want to have any life or any other thing on there. And you basically need a three-socketed tiara, right, with all res on them. So it would be a very hard build to complete, even if we did something crazy like to clear Ubers. Even if we did something crazy like we tripled the Valkyrie's life with a synergy, um, it would still be very difficult to clear Ubers with this build. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. This was sort of like my meme build for the season. After I got tired of playing Hemomancer and automatically winning the game, I decided to play whatever the hell this is. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. I love you. Goodbye.